It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon at Mac's Diner, the kind of place where nothing exciting ever happened, or at least, that's how it seemed to everyone passing through. The diner sat on the edge of a small town, its neon sign flickering slightly as if it were tired from years of service. Inside, the smell of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee lingered in the air, a comforting scent that made regulars feel at home. Emily Dawson, 22 years old, was at her usual spot behind the counter, wiping it down for the third time in an hour. It wasn't because it was dirty. In fact, she prided herself on keeping the diner spotless. Wiping the counter was her way of staying busy, especially during these long, slow afternoons. To most people, Emily seemed like your average young woman, a cheerful, hard-working cashier with a bright smile and kind eyes. The regulars knew her well enough to say hello and make small talk, but none of them really knew her. She liked it that way. She kept her life simple and her secrets tucked away where no one could find them. Her father had taught her that. Stay humble, stay quiet, and never draw attention to yourself, he used to say, his voice firm yet loving. Let them underestimate you. It's your greatest weapon. Emily took those words to heart, even if the people around her never suspected there was more to her than meets the eye. They saw her as the nice girl behind the counter, always ready with a smile and a refill. What they didn't see was the years of training, the discipline, and the lessons that had shaped her into someone far more capable than they could ever imagine. But Emily wasn't one to brag. She didn't want recognition or praise. She just wanted a quiet life, one where she didn't have to use the skills her father had spent years teaching her. She glanced around the diner. Old Mr. Jenkins sat in his usual booth by the window, reading the local newspaper. A young couple shared a plate of fries at the counter, their heads close as they whispered and laughed. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking the passing of another ordinary day. And then, they walked in. The door swung open with a loud creak, followed by the heavy thud of boots against the tile floor. 3 men entered, their leather jackets gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The first was tall and broad, with a snake tattoo coiled around his neck. The second had a wiry build and a scruffy beard, while the third was shorter but stocky, his arms covered in faded tattoos. Emily noticed them immediately, though she didn't let it show. Her instincts kicked in, the same instincts her father had drilled into her since she was a child. Always assess the situation. Stay calm. Stay in control. The bikers moved like they owned the place, their loud laughter cutting through the quiet atmosphere of the diner. They weren't the kind of customers Emily was eager to serve, but she didn't have the luxury of being selective. As always, she put on her best smile, masking the unease that rippled through her. "Hey, sweetheart," the tallest one drawled, leaning on the counter with a cocky smirk. "Got any specials for us today?" Emily straightened up, her smile never wavering. "Our burgers are popular," she said, her voice calm and polite. "And the pie's fresh out of the oven." The man chuckled, nudging his friend. "Fresh pie, huh? Sounds tempting." His tone was casual, but there was something in his eyes that made Emily's stomach tighten. She glanced at the other 2 bikers, who were looking around the diner with amused expressions, as if they found the whole place laughable. 3 coffees, the scruffy one said, his voice gruff. "Black. And make it quick." "Of course," Emily replied, turning to the coffee pot. She moved with practiced ease, but her mind was racing. She had seen men like this before, men who walked into a room and expected everyone to bow to their presence. They were loud, brash, and used to getting their way. As she poured the coffee, she kept her eyes on them, discreetly observing their movements. The tall one was fiddling with the salt shaker, twisting the cap off and spilling salt onto the counter. The wiry one leaned against a booth, eyeing the young couple with a smirk that made Emily's blood boil. The stocky one, meanwhile, was pacing near the door, glancing outside as if keeping watch. "Here you go," Emily said, placing the coffees on the counter. She kept her tone neutral, neither overly friendly nor dismissive. The tall biker took a sip, then grimaced. "Too hot," he complained, pushing the cup away. "What, you trying to burn my tongue?" "I'm sorry about that," Emily said, reaching for the cup. "I can add some cream to cool it down." He waved her off. "Forget it." His eyes lingered on her, studying her like she was some sort of puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. "You're new here, huh?" Emily shook her head. "I've been here a while." "Haven't seen you before," he said, leaning closer. "You from around here?" "I grew up nearby," she replied, keeping her answers short. "Quiet little town," the scruffy one chimed in, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Bet nothing ever happens here." Emily didn't respond. She knew better than to engage with men like this. The less she said, the less they could use against her. The young couple at the counter suddenly stood up, their fries half eaten. The girl whispered something to her boyfriend, and they quickly made their way to the door, avoiding eye contact with the bikers. "Ah, looks like we scared them off," the stocky one said with a laugh. "Guess we're just too much for this place." The tall biker smirked, his gaze returning to Emily. "What about you, sweetheart? You scared of us?" Emily met his eyes, her expression calm and unreadable. "No," she said simply. For a moment, there was silence. The tall biker raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her response. Then he laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that filled the diner. "I like her," he said, slapping the counter. "Got some guts, this one." Emily didn't react. Inside, her nerves were taut, every muscle in her body on alert. She knew she had to stay composed, but she also knew these men weren't here for coffee and conversation. She glanced at the clock on the wall. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The diner felt smaller somehow, the walls closing in as the tension thickened. Emily's mind raced as she tried to decide her next move. Should she call for help? Would the police get here in time? Or should she handle this herself, the way her father had taught her? As the bikers continued to joke and laugh, Emily's fingers brushed against the edge of the counter, steadying herself. Whatever happened next, she was ready. She had to be. The laughter of the bikers filled the diner, loud and unsettling, like it belonged to men who enjoyed making people uncomfortable. Emily kept her face composed, her smile steady, but inside, she was counting the steps to the back exit, calculating how long it would take to grab the phone hidden under the counter. The tall biker, Snake Emily decided to call him that in her mind because of the tattoo on his neck, leaned even closer. His voice dropped, like he was sharing a secret only for her. "You seem awfully calm, sweetheart. Don't people like us make you nervous?" Emily's eyes flicked to the clock again. "Stay calm. Stay measured." Her father's voice echoed in her mind like a mantra. "I've seen a lot of people come through this diner," she replied evenly. "Takes more than some big personalities to rattle me." Snake chuckled, clearly amused by her response. "Big personalities, huh?" He turned to his companions. "You hear that, boys? We're just big personalities." The others laughed, slapping the counter and making the silverware jump. Emily felt the tension in the room thicken, but she refused to back down. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, keeping her tone professional. The wiry one, who had been leaning against a booth, straightened up and sauntered over to the counter. His leather jacket squeaked slightly as he moved. "Yeah," he said, flashing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "How about a smile? Or is that extra?" Emily didn't flinch. "Smiles are free," she said calmly. "But if you're not happy with the service, there's always the road outside." The man blinked, momentarily stunned by her quiet confidence. The stocky biker let out a bark of laughter. Oh, she's got fire. I like her. Emily's fingers gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles whitening slightly. She wasn't trying to be brave for the sake of it, she just knew from experience that fear would only encourage them. And she wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. As the laughter continued, old Mr. Jenkins folded his newspaper and stood up from his booth. He grabbed his cane, his movements slow and deliberate, and shuffled toward the door. Emily caught his eye and gave him a reassuring nod. You take care now, young lady, he said softly, his voice tinged with concern. I will, Mr. Jenkins, she replied, watching as he pushed the door open and stepped out into the afternoon sun. For a brief moment, she wished she could follow him, leave the tension and unease behind. But she couldn't. This was her job, her space, and she wasn't about to let anyone make her feel unsafe in it. The wiry biker leaned closer, his grin returning. So, what's a girl like you doing in a place like this? Emily turned her attention to the coffee pot, pouring a fresh cup for herself to keep her hands busy. Working, she said simply. He snorted. Yeah, I figured that much. But why here? This town's dead, and this diner's barely breathing. Emily shrugged. I like the quiet. Snake chuckled, taking another sip of his coffee. Quiet, huh? Well, you must love us then. We're the life of the party. The stocky one, who had been pacing near the door, suddenly spoke up. Hey, Snake, maybe she likes more than just the quiet. Maybe she likes a little danger. Emily kept her expression neutral, but her grip on the coffee cup tightened. The stocky man's tone was teasing, but there was an edge to it that made her skin crawl. Do you? Snake asked, his smirk widening. You like danger, sweetheart. Emily set her cup down and looked him in the eye. What I like is keeping this diner running smoothly. So, unless you're planning to order dessert, I'd appreciate it if you'd let me get back to work. For a moment, the diner went silent. The bikers stared at her, their expressions a mix of surprise and amusement. Then Snake laughed again, loud and long. Oh, she's got a mouth on her, he said, shaking his head. I like her. Got guts, this one. Emily didn't respond. She glanced over her shoulder, where Danny, the 17-year-old busboy, was peeking out from the kitchen. His eyes were wide, his face pale, and Emily gave him a subtle nod to let him know she had things under control. Danny ducked back into the kitchen, but she could feel his nervous energy even from across the room. She couldn't blame him, these men weren't exactly the friendly, neighborhood type. The wiry biker slid onto a stool at the counter, resting his elbows on the surface. So, what's your name? Emily hesitated for a split second, then decided it was safer to give them something than to refuse outright. Emily. Emily, he repeated, rolling the name around like he was trying it on for size. Nice name. Got a last name? She smiled faintly. Just Emily. Snake chuckled, tapping his finger on the counter. Mysterious. I like that. Keeps things interesting. The stocky biker, who had been fiddling with the jukebox by the door, turned around. This place got any good music? Depends on what you like, Emily replied. He scoffed, punching a button on the jukebox. A scratchy country tune crackled to life, filling the diner with twangy guitars and melancholic lyrics. This'll do, he said, leaning against the wall with a satisfied grin. Emily glanced at the clock again. Only 5 minutes had passed since they'd arrived, but it felt like an eternity. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Snake's voice broke the silence. So, Emily, you got a boyfriend? Emily's stomach tightened. She hated questions like this, especially from men like him. But she kept her cool, her smile unwavering. I don't see how that's any of your business. The wiry biker laughed, clapping his hands. Oh, she's feisty. I love it. Snake leaned back, his grin never fading. Relax, sweetheart. Just making conversation. Emily didn't respond. She busied herself wiping down the counter again, her movements precise and controlled. She could feel their eyes on her, watching her every move, but she refused to let it get to her. Her father's voice echoed in her mind once more, always stay one step ahead. Observe. Plan. Act. As the bikers continued to laugh and joke, Emily's gaze flicked to the security camera in the corner. She made sure it was still recording, the little red light blinking steadily. Let them laugh, she thought. Let them underestimate me. What they didn't know, what no one in this diner knew, was that Emily Dawson wasn't just the quiet cashier with a friendly smile. She was her father's daughter, and he had made sure she could handle herself in any situation. And if these men pushed her too far, they were about to find out just how much they had underestimated her. Emily's polite tone faltered for a split second, but she recovered quickly. We've got a great deal on the burgers, she replied, her voice steady but measured. Burgers, huh? The man sneered, a smirk creeping across his face. His buddies chuckled as they scanned the small diner, their eyes lingering too long on each customer. It was clear they weren't here just for food. The leader, the tall man with the snake tattoo curling around his neck, snapped his fingers as if he were summoning a servant. How about you give us a discount? Something special for us, special guys. Emily's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but her polite demeanor never wavered. She had learned long ago that people like them thrived on intimidation. Giving them any reaction only fueled their arrogance. Sorry, she said evenly, but the prices are the same for everyone. Snake raised an eyebrow, leaning in closer. The faint scent of motor oil and cigarettes clung to his leather jacket. Come on, sweetheart, he said in a mockingly sweet tone. Surely you can bend the rules a little for us. Behind her, Emily heard Danny, the teenage busboy, drop a tray in the kitchen. The sound clattered loudly in the tense silence. She didn't turn around. Danny was a good kid, but she knew he was scared. She couldn't blame him, these men weren't the kind you crossed lightly. The wiry biker, who had been leaning against the counter, laughed and slapped Snake on the shoulder. She's playing hard to get, boss. Maybe she doesn't like your style. Snake's expression darkened for a brief moment before he smiled again, though there was no humor in it. He turned to Emily and tilted his head. You've got guts, I'll give you that. But maybe you should think twice before mouthing off to guys like us. Emily felt the weight of the entire diner on her shoulders. The few remaining patrons avoided eye contact, staring at their coffee cups or out the window. No one wanted to get involved, but she couldn't blame them. These men were trouble, and everyone knew it. Is there anything else I can get for you? Emily asked, keeping her tone even. The stocky biker, who had been pacing near the booths, suddenly slammed his hand on the nearest table. The sound made a woman in the corner jump. Yeah, he growled. You can stop pretending you're not scared. Emily's heart raced, but she refused to let it show. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and met his glare head on. I'm not pretending anything. I just don't see the point in being rude to customers. Snake let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Oh, you've got fire, all right. I like that. He reached into his jacket pocket, and for a tense moment, Emily's mind raced. But all he pulled out was a pack of gum. You got a name, sweetheart? Snake asked as he popped a piece of gum into his mouth. Emily, she replied, her voice steady. Well, Emily, he said, chewing loudly, you're either real brave or real stupid. I haven't decided which yet. The wiry biker laughed again, clearly enjoying the exchange. Maybe she's both. I like a girl with a little fight in her. Emily ignored him, turning to refill the coffee pot. She needed a moment to think, to breathe. The situation was spiraling, and she knew she had to stay calm. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, "Control the situation. Don't let it control you." Snake leaned against the counter, watching her every move. "So, Emily," he said, drawing out her name, "you work here all alone? Or is there someone in the back who's gonna come out and give us a hard time?" She placed the coffee pot back on the burner, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I'm not alone," she said simply, leaving it at that. Snake studied her for a moment, as if trying to decide whether she was bluffing. Then he smirked and turned to his companions. "What do you think, boys? Should we stick around and keep her company?" The stocky biker grinned. "I'm good with that. Place could use a little excitement." Emily felt her stomach churn, but she pushed the fear down. She couldn't let them see it. Instead, she stepped out from behind the counter, her movements deliberate and controlled. "If you're not going to order anything else, I'll have to ask you to leave," she said firmly, her voice carrying a quiet authority that surprised even herself. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath. The bikers stared at her, their smirks faltering for a split second. Then Snake burst out laughing, the sound sharp and grating. "Ask us to leave," he repeated, his voice dripping with mockery. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But here's the thing, Emily, we're not going anywhere." The tension in the diner was palpable now, thick enough to cut with a knife. Emily glanced toward the kitchen window, where Danny's pale face peeked out. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, silently telling him to stay put. Snake leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, almost menacing tone. "You see, sweetheart, we like it here. The coffee's good, the company's entertaining. So why don't you go ahead and bring us another round?" Emily clenched her fists at her sides, willing herself to stay calm. "Control the situation. Don't let it control you." "I'll get your coffee," she said finally, her voice steady. "But after that, I want you to leave." Snake's grin widened. "Sure thing, sweetheart. Whatever you say." As Emily turned to grab the coffee pot, her mind raced. She needed to find a way to de-escalate the situation without provoking them further. But deep down, she knew these men weren't interested in coffee or conversation. They were here to intimidate, to remind everyone in the room that they were the ones in control. Her father's training kicked in, a quiet voice in the back of her mind that kept her focused. Assess the threat. Look for weaknesses. Plan your next move. She poured the coffee with steady hands, pretending not to notice the bikers whispering and laughing among themselves. When she set the mugs down in front of them, Snake looked up at her with a smug expression. "Thanks, Emily," he said, his tone mockingly polite. "You're a real sweetheart." Emily didn't respond. She turned and walked back behind the counter, her heart pounding. She needed to think, to figure out her next move. But as she glanced around the diner, she realized something important. These men thought they were in control. They thought she was just a scared little cashier, someone they could push around for fun. They didn't know who she really was. And if they kept pushing, they were about to find out. Snake tapped his spoon against his coffee mug in an irritating rhythm, his smirk still firmly in place. The other two bikers settled into a booth by the window, their laughter carrying through the diner like nails scraping a chalkboard. The stocky one, whose name Emily overheard as Tank, began flipping through the sugar packets on the table, tossing them one by one onto the floor. "Oops," he said with mock innocence. "Guess someone's got a mess to clean up." Emily glanced at the growing pile on the floor but didn't move. Instead, she turned her attention back to Snake, who seemed intent on keeping her within arm's reach. "Busy day for you, huh?" he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Must get boring in a place like this. I don't mind it, Emily replied, keeping her voice neutral. Snake chuckled. I bet you don't. Quiet little town, quiet little job. You don't strike me as the type to stir up trouble. The wiry biker, who Emily now recognized as Slick, sauntered over to the counter, balancing a salt shaker on his fingertip. Bet she's a good girl, too, he said with a grin. The kind that always follows the rules. Emily didn't respond. Instead, she focused on wiping an already clean section of the counter, her movements slow and deliberate. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting for her to react, to slip up. The air in the diner grew heavier with each passing second. The few remaining customers had quietly paid their bills and slipped out the door, leaving Emily and Danny alone with the bikers. In the kitchen, Danny peeked through the window again, his face pale as a sheet. Emily caught his eye and gave him a subtle nod, a silent assurance that she had things under control. But control was slipping. She could feel it. Tank, clearly bored with his sugar packet game, stood up and walked over to the jukebox in the corner. He slapped it with the palm of his hand, causing the machine to sputter to life. A loud, twangy country song filled the diner, adding an unsettling soundtrack to the scene. That's better, Tank said with a grin, turning back to Snake. This place was too quiet. Snake leaned back in his chair, his boots propped up on the counter. So, Emily, he said, drawing out her name like it was a joke, you got a boyfriend? Husband, maybe. Emily kept her expression blank. Why do you ask? Just curious, Snake replied, his grin widening. A pretty thing like you, I figure someone must have claimed you by now. Emily didn't take the bait. I don't think that's any of your business. Oh, feisty. Slick said, laughing. I like her, boss. She's got some bite. Snake's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a hint of irritation flickering in his eyes. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the counter. You know, Emily, he said, his voice lower now, I don't think you understand the situation you're in. Emily met his gaze without flinching. I understand just fine. For a moment, the two of them stared each other down, the tension in the room crackling like static electricity. Then Snake leaned back and laughed, breaking the spell. You've got guts, I'll give you that, he said, shaking his head. But guts only get you so far. Behind her, Danny stepped out of the kitchen, his hands trembling as he carried a tray of condiments. He placed it on a nearby table, avoiding eye contact with the bikers. Hey, kid, Slick called out, his grin turning predatory. You got something for us? Danny froze, his wide eyes darting to Emily. She gave him a subtle shake of her head, a silent command to stay quiet. But Slick wasn't about to let it go. He sauntered over to Danny, towering over the scrawny teenager. What's the matter? He asked, his voice mocking. Cat got your tongue. Danny mumbled something unintelligible, his hands clutching the edge of the tray. Leave him alone, Emily said sharply, stepping out from behind the counter. Slick turned to her, his grin widening. Oh, now you're giving orders. That's cute. Yeah, real cute, Tank added, chuckling as he leaned against the jukebox. Emily ignored them, her attention focused on Danny. Go back to the kitchen, she told him firmly. I'll handle this. Danny hesitated, his eyes darting between her and the bikers. But. Go, she repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, Danny retreated to the kitchen, casting one last worried glance over his shoulder. Snake watched the exchange with mild amusement. Protective, aren't we, he said, tapping his fingers against the counter. You don't strike me as the maternal type. Emily didn't respond. Instead, she crossed her arms and stood her ground, her gaze steady. The bikers exchanged glances, their smirks fading as they realized she wasn't backing down. "Well," Snake said, standing up and stretching, "this has been fun, but I think it's time we kicked things up a notch." He reached for a napkin dispenser on the counter and tossed it onto the floor, the loud crash echoing through the diner. Emily didn't flinch. "Oops," Snake said, his grin returning. "Better clean that up, sweetheart." Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her react. Instead, she bent down and picked up the dispenser, placing it back on the counter with deliberate care. Snake clapped his hands mockingly. "Good girl. See? That wasn't so hard." The other two laughed, their voices grating against her nerves. Emily straightened, her eyes narrowing slightly. She was done playing their game. "I think it's time you left," she said, her voice calm but firm. Snake raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her boldness. "Oh, is that so?" "Yes," she replied, meeting his gaze. "You've made your point. Now leave." For a moment, the diner was silent except for the faint hum of the jukebox. Then Snake laughed, a low, menacing sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "You've got some nerve, I'll give you that," he said, stepping closer. "But let me give you a little advice, Emily. It's not a good idea to tell men like us what to do." Emily stood her ground, her heart racing. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, her father's training kicking in like second nature. "Stay calm. Stay focused. Don't show fear." Snake leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You're lucky I'm in a good mood today." Emily didn't blink. "And you're lucky I'm asking nicely." The room seemed to freeze, the air crackling with tension. For a brief moment, it felt like everything was balanced on the edge of a knife. Then Snake stepped back, his grin widening. "You've got fire," he said, shaking his head. "I like that. Come on, boys. Let's get out of here before I change my mind." The other two bikers hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave, but a sharp look from Snake sent them shuffling toward the door. As they left, Snake turned back to Emily one last time. "We'll be seeing you again, sweetheart," he said, his voice full of promise. Emily didn't respond. She stood perfectly still, watching as the door swung shut behind them. The moment they were gone, the tension in the diner evaporated like steam. Emily let out a slow breath, her hands trembling slightly. Behind her, Danny peeked out from the kitchen, his eyes wide. "Are they gone?" "For now," Emily replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Danny stepped into the dining area, his hands still shaking. "What are we gonna do if they come back?" Emily glanced out the window, her expression unreadable. "We'll be ready," she said quietly. Deep down, she knew this wasn't over. The bikers would be back. And when they came, they wouldn't just be looking for coffee. They'd be looking for a fight. Emily's mind worked quickly, her father's teachings echoing in her thoughts. Never act out of fear. Fear clouds judgment. Stay sharp, stay in control. She took a slow breath, stepping back into the dining area, her expression calm and composed. The bikers were still laughing, their voices loud and invasive in the otherwise silent diner. Tank was fiddling with a ketchup bottle, squeezing it into crude shapes on the plate while Slick leaned back in the booth, his boots up on the table, scuffing the surface. Snake, the leader, stood at the counter, lazily stirring his coffee with a smirk that never seemed to leave his face. He glanced up as Emily approached. "Thought you ran off on us," he said, his tone mockingly sweet. "We were starting to miss you." "I was just grabbing extra napkins," Emily replied evenly, setting a neat stack on the counter. Her hands moved with practiced calm, even as her heart raced. "Napkins. How thoughtful." Snake leaned closer, his voice dropping low enough that only she could hear. "You're real good at keeping your cool, aren't you?" Emily didn't flinch. "It's part of the job." Snake chuckled, clearly enjoying her restraint. He straightened up, taking a slow sip of his coffee before setting the mug down with a clink. "You know," he said loudly enough for the others to hear, "I like this place. Got a nice vibe. Maybe we'll make it our regular spot." The other bikers hooted in agreement, Tank slapping the table as if it were the funniest thing he'd heard all day. Emily turned her attention to clearing away an empty table, using the motion as an excuse to keep her distance while observing them closely. She noted every detail: Snake's dominating presence, Tank's reckless energy, Slick's unsettling quietness. And that knife, just a flash of metal, but enough to remind her how dangerous the situation could become. As she wiped down the table, her mind raced. "They're testing me. Trying to push boundaries." Her father's voice came again, clear and steady in her memory. "Most people who act tough just want to see if you'll fold. But some are looking for a fight. Know the difference?" Emily glanced at the clock. Nearly 4:30 p.m. The diner's dinner rush would start soon, bringing in more people. Maybe that would be enough to drive the bikers away. But something told her Snake wasn't the type to back down easily. A subtle warning. The bell above the diner door jingled as Mr. Harris, one of the regulars, shuffled in. The elderly man paused, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. Emily gave him a quick, reassuring nod, silently willing him to sit far away from the bikers. "Afternoon, Emily," Mr. Harris said, his voice tinged with concern. "Quiet day?" "Quieter than usual," she replied, her tone deliberately light. Mr. Harris hesitated, his gaze flickering to Snake, who was now casually inspecting the diner's menu board like he owned the place. With a small shake of his head, Harris shuffled to a booth near the back, sitting with his newspaper spread in front of him. Snake watched him go, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Your regulars don't seem too friendly," he remarked, turning back to Emily. "They're just private," Emily replied, returning to the counter. "Private, huh?" Snake leaned on the counter, his voice dropping low again. "You know, I could say the same about you. Quiet little thing, keeping to yourself. Makes a man wonder what you're hiding." Emily met his gaze steadily, but inside, her nerves prickled. Snake tilted his head, studying her as if he were trying to crack a code. Then, suddenly, he grinned. "Relax, sweetheart. I'm just messing with you." The laugh that followed wasn't friendly, it was sharp and predatory, designed to put her on edge. Just as Emily began stacking clean plates behind the counter, a commotion erupted near the jukebox. "Come on, you piece of junk!" Tank growled, slamming his fist against the machine. The jukebox sputtered, the music cutting in and out. "Leave it alone, Tank," Slick drawled from the booth. "It's older than your brain cells. Not worth the effort." Tank glared at him but stepped away, his frustration clear. He grabbed a chair and dragged it noisily across the floor, sitting with an exaggerated thud. Snake's grin widened, as if he found the entire scene amusing. "Don't mind him," he said to Emily. "Tank's got a short fuse. Always has." Emily's reply was carefully neutral. "Maybe he should try decaf next time." For a split second, there was silence. Then Snake threw his head back and laughed, a genuine laugh this time. "I like her," he said, shaking his head. "She's got guts." But Tank wasn't laughing. He scowled at Emily, his jaw tight. "Careful, boss," he muttered. "Guts can get annoying real quick." Snake waved him off, still chuckling. "Relax, Tank. We're just having fun." Emily's grip tightened on the rag in her hand, her instincts screaming at her to stay alert. Tank's irritation wasn't something to brush off. She had seen men like him before, men who didn't know how to handle being challenged, even in the smallest ways. Her father's voice came to her again, steady and clear. The ones who bark the loudest are often harmless. But the ones who go quiet? Those are the ones to watch. Tank was quiet now. The bell jingled again as another customer entered, a young woman with a toddler on her hip. Emily's heart sank. She didn't want anyone else walking into the situation, especially not someone vulnerable. The woman hesitated, clearly sensing the tension, but Emily quickly waved her over with a warm smile. "Take any seat you like," she said, her tone deliberately welcoming. The woman nodded and settled into a booth near the door, keeping her child close. Emily brought her a menu, her movements quick but calm. As she returned to the counter, she felt Snake's eyes on her again. "Look at you," he said, shaking his head in mock admiration. "Always so polite, so professional. Makes me wonder what it'd take to rattle you." Emily didn't respond. Instead, she busied herself refilling the coffee pot, her back to him. Snake leaned closer, his voice dropping low enough that only she could hear. "Everybody's got a breaking point, sweetheart. Wonder where yours is." Her hands tightened on the coffee pot handle, but she kept her expression neutral. "You're welcome to keep guessing," she said evenly, pouring a fresh cup for Mr. Harris. Snake laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. As the bikers continued their antics, Emily began to notice something, small details that didn't quite add up. Slick, for all his swagger, kept glancing toward the window, as if watching for someone. Tank's aggression seemed more like frustration, as though he was waiting for a cue that hadn't come. And Snake, despite his confident demeanor, had a tension in his shoulders that suggested he wasn't as relaxed as he pretended to be. "They're stalling." The realization hit her like a jolt. They weren't just here to cause trouble, they were waiting for something. Or someone. Emily's mind raced as she pieced it together. Snake's earlier comment about making the diner their regular spot suddenly took on a different meaning. This wasn't random. They had a purpose for being here, and whatever it wasn't good. She glanced at the clock again. 4:45 p.m. The dinner rush would start soon, bringing in more customers. More witnesses. More potential targets. Her father's voice came again, calm and steady. "When you see the storm coming, don't wait for it to hit. Move." Emily made a decision. She turned to Snake, her expression carefully neutral. "You boys need anything else?" Snake looked up, surprised by her sudden directness. "Why? You trying to get rid of us?" "Not at all," she replied smoothly. "Just making sure you're taken care of." Snake studied her for a moment, then leaned back in his chair, his grin returning. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" Emily didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked to the kitchen, her movements calm and deliberate. Once out of sight, she grabbed her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. "Dad," she whispered when the line connected, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "I need your help." Emily's father's voice came through the phone, gravelly but instantly calming. "What's going on, kiddo?" Her words were quick, precise, another skill drilled into her by years of his training. "3 bikers, possibly armed. Acting aggressive, but there's something more. They're stalling, waiting for something. The situation's tense, but under control for now." There was a brief pause on the other end. When he spoke again, his voice was all business. "Good. Stay that way. Keep the tension manageable. What's your read on their intentions?" Emily glanced back through the small window in the kitchen door, watching the bikers. Tank was tapping the edge of his knife against the table now, Slick still staring out the window. Snake leaned casually against the counter, but his eyes darted around the diner like he was assessing everything inside. They're not here just to harass, Emily whispered. Feels like they're waiting for backup or someone specific. They're too on edge to just be passing through. Her father's tone hardened. All right, listen carefully. Don't escalate. Let them think they're in control. Keep civilians safe, but if it comes to it, his voice softened for just a moment. You know what to do. Emily nodded, even though he couldn't see her. Got it? Help's on the way, but it'll take time. Stay sharp. I'll be there as soon as I can. She ended the call, slipping her phone back into her pocket. The sense of calm she felt now wasn't entirely her own, it was her father's voice, his trust in her abilities, the years of preparation she never thought she'd need. But now it was real. Emily returned to the dining area, her expression composed. Snake looked up from his coffee as she approached. Everything good back there? He asked, his tone casual but laced with suspicion. Just checking on the kitchen, Emily replied smoothly. Making sure we're ready for the dinner rush. Snake's grin returned. You're efficient, I'll give you that. She ignored the comment and turned her attention to Mr. Harris, refilling his coffee cup. Everything okay, Mr. Harris? She asked quietly, her voice just loud enough for him to hear. The older man nodded but gave her a look that said he wasn't fooled by her calm demeanor. You let me know if you need anything, young lady, he said softly. Emily nodded, grateful for his quiet support. As she moved around the diner, she began making small adjustments, subtle, almost imperceptible. She positioned herself closer to the kitchen door, where the heavy frying pans were within reach. She made sure the coffee pot was full and steaming, an innocent object that could double as a defensive tool if needed. She also took note of the other customers. The young woman with the toddler was seated near the door, a strategic spot if Emily needed to get her out quickly. Danny was still frozen behind the kitchen window, his wide eyes watching the scene unfold. She made a mental note to keep him there, it was safer than having him out in the open. The clock ticked closer to 5 p.m., and the tension in the diner grew thicker. Slick, who had been quietly watching the window, suddenly sat up straighter. They're here, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Snake to hear. Emily's stomach dropped. Snake's demeanor shifted subtly, his relaxed posture giving way to something more deliberate. He glanced at Tank, who immediately stood up, his knife now fully visible in his hand. Emily kept her expression neutral, but her mind raced. Who's they? What are they planning? The bell above the door jingled again, and two more men walked in. They were dressed similarly to the bikers' leather jackets, boots, the same air of quiet menace. Snake greeted them with a nod. Took you long enough. Traffic, one of them replied curtly, his eyes scanning the diner. The newcomers took seats at a booth near the back, their presence adding another layer of unease to the room. Emily noted the way they positioned themselves, one facing the door, the other facing the dining area. They were covering the exits. Snake turned back to Emily, his smirk returning. Looks like we've got ourselves a full house now. How about some service for my friends here? Emily nodded, forcing herself to stay calm. Of course. Coffee. Make it quick, Snake said, his tone sharper than before. As she moved to the coffee station, she caught a glimpse of Mr. Harris watching the new arrivals closely. The older man's hands were steady, but there was a tension in his posture that told her he was ready to act if needed. Good, Emily thought. Back up, even if it's quiet. As Emily poured the coffee, she listened carefully to the bikers' conversation. They spoke in low tones, but certain words stood out: shipment, pickup, boss. Her suspicions were confirmed. This wasn't random. The diner was being used as a meeting point for something bigger. Snake's voice broke through her thoughts. Hey, sweetheart, you planning to keep that coffee all to yourself? Emily turned with the pot in hand, her expression neutral. Coming right up. As she approached the booth with the newcomers, she noticed something tucked under the table, an unmarked black bag. Her heart pounded, but she kept her movements steady, setting the coffee mugs down without a word. The man closest to her, a burly figure with a scar across his cheek, gave her a curt nod. "Thanks." Emily stepped back, her mind racing. The bag could mean anything: money, weapons, drugs. Whatever it was the reason they were here. Stay calm. Stay in control. She returned to the counter, her eyes meeting Snake's for a brief moment. His smirk deepened, as if he could sense her unease. "Funny thing about small towns," he said, his voice carrying through the diner. "People think they're safe. Think nothing bad ever happens here." Emily didn't respond, but her grip on the counter tightened. Snake leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're good at playing it cool, sweetheart. But I wonder how long that'll last." Emily held his gaze, her expression unreadable. Inside, she was counting every second, every movement. Her father's words echoed in her mind: "The moment they think they've won is the moment you strike." She wasn't there yet. But she was ready. The diner was silent, save for the labored groans of the bikers sprawled on the floor. The regulars stared, wide-eyed, at the young cashier who had just taken down 3 men like it was another part of her job. Emily stood tall, her breathing even, surveying the scene with practiced precision. Snake, the leader, pushed himself up on his elbows, his cocky grin now replaced by a mask of disbelief and fear. What are you?" he stammered. Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she knelt beside Tank, who was clutching his dislocated shoulder. She yanked the knife from his jacket and tossed it onto the counter with a clatter. Then she turned back to Snake, her calm, measured voice slicing through the tension. "You walked in here thinking you could bully a diner full of people. You picked the wrong place, the wrong day, and definitely the wrong person." Snake's hand moved toward his boot, where Emily knew another weapon was likely hidden. She didn't wait to see what it was. In a single motion, she closed the gap between them, pinning his arm to the ground with her knee. "Don't even think about it," she warned, her tone cold as steel. "Whatever you've got, it's not fast enough." The sound of sirens in the distance made the other bikers freeze. Slick, cradling a likely fractured wrist, looked toward the door. "Cops are coming," he muttered, panic creeping into his voice. Snake snarled, his bravado flickering back for a moment. "You think this is over? My guys will." Emily cut him off. "Your guys will find themselves in the same position as you. Flat on the ground, wondering where it all went wrong." She stood, letting the sirens fill the room. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to sit here, nice and quiet, and wait for the police. If you try anything, I'll make sure you regret it. Clear?" Snake glared at her but didn't respond. Emily stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper only he could hear. "Clear." He nodded stiffly. The sirens stopped abruptly as 2 police cars screeched to a halt outside the diner. Officers poured in, guns drawn, only to stop short at the sight of Emily standing over the subdued bikers. "Emily?" one of the officers asked, lowering his weapon. It was Sheriff Cole, a longtime family friend. His confusion was evident. "What happened here?" Emily exhaled and straightened. "These men were causing trouble. Armed and dangerous. I had to step in before anyone got hurt." Sheriff Cole took in the scene: the knives on the counter, the groaning bikers, and the calm determination in Emily's stance. "You stepped in." She nodded, her expression unreadable. One of the officers cuffed Snake, hauling him to his feet. "Who are you, lady?" Snake spat, his voice laced with frustration and pain. Sheriff Cole answered for her, a mixture of awe and amusement in his voice. "You're looking at Emily Dawson." Her father's James Dawson, retired Navy SEAL and one of the best we've ever had. Looks like she's a chip off the old block. The bikers' faces went pale. The full weight of their mistake seemed to hit them all at once. Emily allowed herself a small smile. He taught me well. As the bikers were let out in cuffs, the atmosphere in the diner shifted. Danny finally stepped out from the kitchen, his face a mix of fear and admiration. You just, he gestured vaguely at the scene. I know, Emily said gently, her tone softening now that the danger had passed. Are you okay? Danny nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. I think so. Mr. Harris, ever the calm observer, stood and tipped his hat to her. Miss Emily, I've seen a lot in my time, but I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like that. Your father must be proud. Emily's cheeks reddened slightly. Thank you, Mr. Harris. I just did what needed to be done. The young mother with the toddler approached cautiously. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here, she said, her voice trembling. Thank you. Emily offered a reassuring smile. You're safe now. That's all that matters. As the crowd thinned out, Emily finally allowed herself a moment to breathe. She sat at the counter, her hands steady but her mind replaying every move, every decision. Her father's voice echoed in her thoughts, you'll know what to do when the time comes. Trust yourself. The bell above the door jingled again, and she looked up to see her father walking in. James Dawson was a towering man, his presence commanding but comforting. His eyes scanned the diner, taking in the aftermath before settling on Emily. Looks like you had a busy day, he said, his voice carrying a hint of pride. Emily shrugged, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Just another Tuesday. James chuckled, sitting beside her. You did good, kiddo. Real good. For the first time that day, Emily let herself relax. The tension melted away as she realized she had done exactly what she was trained to do, protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The events of the day left an indelible mark on everyone in the diner. Emily was no longer just the quiet cashier with a friendly smile. She was someone people would look at differently now, someone they'd respect and rely on. But for Emily, the day was a reminder of something else, that her father's lessons were more than just skills. They were a part of her, shaping who she was and how she faced the world. As she locked up the diner that evening, she glanced at the security camera one last time. The footage would tell a story, but the truth of the moment was something only those inside would ever truly understand. Sometimes, the quietest person in the room held the loudest strength. And today, Emily had proved that in more ways than one. As the last of the bikers was escorted out, the chatter in the diner returned in hushed whispers. Emily could feel the weight of the stares on her, but she didn't mind. It wasn't often that the quiet cashier turned into the most formidable person in the room. Danny approached her cautiously, holding a tray of glasses as if it were a shield. Emily. I had no idea you could do that. How did you learn all of that? Emily paused, considering her answer. She glanced at the clock on the wall, a deliberate stalling tactic. It's a long story, Danny. I've got time, he replied, his awe overriding his usual timidity. Emily sighed, leaning against the counter. My dad taught me. He spent years training me in self-defense, situational awareness, all that Navy SEAL stuff. It's not something I talk about much. Danny's eyes widened. Your dad's a Navy SEAL. Was, she corrected, a small smile tugging at her lips. He's retired now. But some lessons stick with you. Across the diner, Mr. Harris nodded knowingly, as if this revelation explained everything. I knew there was something different about you, Emily, he said, sipping his coffee. The way you carry yourself, it's not like most folks your age. Emily chuckled softly, shaking her head. I think you're giving me too much credit, Mr. Harris. I'm just trying to keep things running smoothly here. But Mr. Harris wasn't the only one who saw her differently now. The young mother with the toddler approached again, this time with more confidence. Emily, I just want to say thank you again. I didn't know what those men were going to do, and you stopped them. Emily met her gaze, her voice steady. You don't need to thank me. I just did what anyone would have done. But even as she said it, she knew that wasn't entirely true. Most people wouldn't have acted so decisively, so fearlessly. It was a trait her father had instilled in her, and one she had spent years honing. As the officers wrapped up their reports, Sheriff Cole pulled Emily aside. You've got a knack for handling yourself, Emily, he said, his tone both impressed and concerned. But that was risky. What if they'd been more armed or had backup? Emily crossed her arms, her expression calm but firm. I assessed the situation. They weren't here for a full-scale attack. They were just looking to intimidate people, maybe shake us down for a few bucks. If they had backup, they wouldn't have wasted time playing games. The sheriff nodded slowly, recognizing the logic in her words. Still, you shouldn't have to deal with this kind of thing. It's not your job. Emily's gaze softened. Sometimes, Sheriff, you don't get to choose when you step up. You just do. He studied her for a moment, then sighed. Your dad would be proud. I'll make sure these guys are dealt with properly. But Emily, be careful. Not everyone out there is going to go down as easily as these clowns did. Understood, she replied, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. When Emily's father, James Dawson, arrived later that evening, the diner had mostly emptied out. The remaining patrons gave him knowing nods, as if his daughter's actions had added to his already legendary reputation. James walked straight to Emily, his boots thudding softly against the worn tile floor. You okay, kiddo? He asked, his tone casual but laced with concern. Emily nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. Nothing I couldn't handle. James raised an eyebrow, glancing around at the aftermath, the overturned chairs, the shattered salt shaker, and the lingering tension in the air. Yeah, I can see that. He leaned against the counter, folding his arms. You used the moves I taught you. Emily shrugged. Some of them. Adapted where I needed to. James chuckled, pride evident in his eyes. That's my girl. Back at the police station, Snake and his gang were locked in a holding cell, their arrogance stripped away. Snake paced the small space, muttering under his breath. She didn't even flinch, he said, shaking his head. How does some diner cashier move like that? Tank, nursing his shoulder, groaned. She's not just some cashier. Didn't you hear the sheriff? Navy SEAL blood runs in her veins. We messed with the wrong girl. Snake slammed his fist against the bars, his frustration boiling over. This isn't over. Nobody makes a fool out of me. But deep down, even he knew they were outmatched. Later that night, Emily drove home with her father, the quiet hum of the engine filling the space between them. You know, James began, breaking the silence, I always wondered when you'd need to use what I taught you. Never thought it'd happen in a diner, though. Emily chuckled softly, her hands steady on the wheel. Life's unpredictable like that. James turned to look at her, his expression serious. You handled yourself well today. But remember, Emily, it's not just about knowing how to fight. It's about knowing when to fight. She nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. I know, Dad. I wasn't looking for a fight. But they left me no choice. James leaned back in his seat, a trace of a smile on his lips. Good. You've got a good head on your shoulders, kiddo. Keep it that way. The next day, the diner was abuzz with gossip about the previous afternoon's events. Regulars came and went, each sharing their version of the story. Did you hear? Emily took down 3 bikers like it was nothing, one man said, shaking his head in disbelief. Yeah, and they say her dad's a Navy SEAL. Guess it runs in the family, another added. Emily listened quietly, her focus on refilling coffee cups and clearing tables. She wasn't one for the spotlight, but she understood that her actions had left an impression. Danny, however, wasn't so reserved. Emily's a hero, he told anyone who would listen. She saved all of us yesterday. Emily shot him a look, but Danny just grinned. By the end of the week, things had mostly returned to normal. The bikers were facing charges, the diner had cleaned up the mess, and Emily was back to her usual routine. But something had shifted. The people who once saw her as just a cashier now saw her as a protector, someone who wouldn't back down in the face of danger. For Emily, it wasn't about recognition or praise. It was about knowing she had done the right thing, just as her father had taught her. And as she looked out at the diner, filled with the hum of conversation and clinking dishes, she felt a quiet sense of pride. The sirens grew louder, flashing red and blue lights bouncing off the diner's windows. The tension in the room began to ease as uniformed officers stormed through the doors, their presence authoritative and reassuring. Sheriff Cole stepped in first, his hand resting on the holster at his side. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, taking in the overturned chairs, the shattered plates, and the groaning bikers sprawled across the floor. He glanced at Emily, who stood calmly behind the counter as though nothing unusual had happened. "What do we have here?" the sheriff asked, his tone both curious and amused. Emily gestured toward the men with a nod of her head. "A few troublemakers who thought they could intimidate us. They found out otherwise." Cole raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. "I can see that." He motioned to his deputies. "Cuff 'em. Get these boys into the truck." The bikers, their swagger gone, offered no resistance as they were hauled to their feet. Snake, the leader, winced as a deputy tightened the cuffs around his wrists. He turned to Emily, his lips curling into a weak sneer. "This ain't over, sweetheart," he muttered. Emily's expression didn't waver. She leaned forward slightly, her voice low but firm. "Oh, it's over. Trust me." Snake's smirk faltered, and for the first time, genuine fear flashed in his eyes. As the police led the bikers out, Danny finally found his voice. "Emily," he stammered, you, how did you do that?" Emily glanced at him, a small smile playing on her lips. "It's a long story, Danny." Danny shook his head, still trying to process what he had just witnessed. "You were like a ninja." "No, a superhero." "I mean, who even are you?" The corner of Emily's mouth twitched, but she said nothing. Instead, she grabbed a cloth and began wiping down the counter, the motion deliberate and calming. Danny followed her, undeterred. "Seriously, though? Those guys were huge. And you just took them down like it was nothing. Do you have some kind of secret training or something?" Emily paused, her gaze flickering to the framed photo on the wall. It was an old picture of her and her father, taken on the day he retired from the Navy SEALs. She turned back to Danny, her tone light but meaningful. "Let's just say I've had a good teacher." As the deputies loaded the bikers into the patrol cars, Sheriff Cole lingered inside the diner. He approached Emily, his expression a mix of respect and concern. "You handled yourself well," he said. "Better than most people would've." Emily nodded. "Thanks, Sheriff. But I didn't have much of a choice." Cole studied her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "I get that. But you need to be careful, Emily. These kinds of guys. They don't take kindly to being humiliated. They might try to come back." Emily met his eyes, her expression steady. "If they do, I'll be ready." The sheriff sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. You've got guts, I'll give you that. But don't hesitate to call us next time, alright? You don't have to do this alone. I appreciate that, Emily replied. But sometimes, you have to handle things in the moment. Cole nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. Just be careful, he repeated before turning to leave. As the police cars disappeared down the road, the remaining patrons began to relax. Conversations resumed, albeit in hushed tones, as everyone tried to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Mr. Harris, the elderly regular, gave Emily an approving nod. You've got a lot more grit than most folks, young lady. Your dad must be proud. Emily smiled faintly. Thanks, Mr. Harris. The young mother who had been sitting near the window approached cautiously, her toddler clutching her leg. Emily, she said softly, thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in. Emily's gaze softened. I'm just glad you're okay. The woman hesitated, then added, you're more than just a cashier, aren't you? Emily chuckled lightly. Everyone's got a story. Mine's just a little different. Later that evening, as the diner closed for the night, Emily sat at one of the booths, staring out the window at the darkened street. Her father, James Dawson, walked in, his presence immediately grounding. Sheriff called me, he said, sliding into the seat across from her. Told me you had quite a day. Emily shrugged, her tone nonchalant. Nothing I couldn't handle. James leaned back, studying her. That's what worries me. You're too much like me. Emily raised an eyebrow. Is that supposed to be a bad thing? James smiled faintly, shaking his head. Not bad. Just dangerous. People like us, we don't always know when to stop. You're lucky this time, but things could have gone differently. Emily's expression grew serious. I wasn't looking for trouble, Dad. But when it came to me, I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. James nodded slowly. I know. And I'm proud of you for that. But remember, Emily, not every fight is worth fighting. Sometimes, the best move is knowing when to walk away. She sighed, her gaze drifting to the window. I hear you, Dad. But in that moment, walking away wasn't an option. James reached across the table, placing a hand on hers. Just promise me you'll be careful, all right? You've got nothing to prove to anyone. Emily met his eyes, her resolve clear. I promise. The next morning, the local news ran a story about the incident, highlighting how the bikers had been apprehended and were facing charges for attempted extortion and assault. The reporter mentioned Emily by name, calling her a brave young woman who stood up against dangerous criminals. Emily cringed at the attention, but Danny was thrilled. You're famous, he exclaimed, holding up his phone to show her the article. Great, Emily muttered, rolling her eyes. That's exactly what I wanted. But despite her discomfort, she couldn't help feeling a sense of satisfaction. The bikers were behind bars, and the diner was safe for now. As the days passed, life at Mac's Diner gradually returned to normal. The regulars continued to drop by for their coffee and pie, though they now looked at Emily with a newfound respect. Danny, however, couldn't stop talking about the incident. Do you think they'll make a movie about this? He asked one afternoon, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Emily laughed, shaking her head. Let's hope not. I'd rather stay under the radar. But even as she joked, she knew that day had changed something. Not just in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself. For years, she had kept her father's training hidden, unsure if she would ever need to use it. Now, she realized it wasn't just about self-defense, it was about standing up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. As Emily closed up the diner one night, she glanced at the photo of her and her dad hanging on the wall. She smiled softly, her fingers brushing the edge of the frame. "Thanks, Dad," she murmured. "For everything." And with that, she turned off the lights and locked the door, ready to face whatever came next. The last of the evening sun filtered through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Emily Dawson stood at the counter, finishing her closing duties with a steady hand. The usual quietness of the diner had returned, but something was different this time. There was a weight in the air, a kind of peaceful stillness that followed after something significant had happened. As she wiped down the counter one final time, Emily's eyes flickered to the small wooden shelf above the coffee machine. Resting there, in its usual place, was a badge. The shiny silver badge that had once belonged to her father, James Dawson. The very same badge that had carried years of memories, of stories, of hard-earned respect. A badge worn by a man who had trained his daughter to be strong, to stay vigilant, and to never, ever back down when life presented a challenge. She hadn't looked at the badge in weeks, not since that chaotic morning when the bikers had tried to take control of the diner. But now, as her hands gently traced its outline, Emily felt something shift inside her. She knew her father had always expected her to be prepared, to be ready for anything. He had trained her, whether she realized it or not, to handle the world with quiet strength, to stand up for herself and for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. But, more than that, he had taught her how to keep her emotions in check, how to never let fear dictate her actions. Yet, as the moment of calm settled around her, Emily realized something she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge before: she didn't need that badge anymore. The world didn't need to know who her father was, or what kind of legacy he left behind. She had proven something to herself that day, something much more important. She had shown that she was capable of handling her own battles, that she was strong, not because of the reputation tied to her father, but because of the quiet strength that ran through her veins. As she picked up the badge and slipped it back into her bag, Emily found herself smiling. It wasn't the same smile she had given to the bikers, the one she used to hide her true feelings. No, this smile was different. This one was for herself. Emily had always been a quiet person. Growing up, she was never the loudest in the room, never the one to boast or call attention to herself. She wasn't the one to make waves or demand to be noticed. Instead, she had always quietly observed, learned, and prepared for the day when she would have to step up. It was in her nature to stay in the background, to remain unnoticed, just like the thousands of other people who went about their lives with humility. But Emily knew now that true strength didn't always shout. It didn't always demand the spotlight. Strength could be quiet, patient, and still, like the calm before a storm. The kind of strength that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're capable of, even if the world around you doesn't see it right away. In the past, she had been afraid of showing her power. Afraid that others would judge her for it, that they would misunderstand her actions. But now, after the events of that fateful day, she knew that it didn't matter what others thought. What mattered was what she believed about herself, and how she stood tall in the face of adversity. She had learned that people often underestimated her because they couldn't see past the surface, the polite cashier, the quiet girl behind the counter. They thought her strength was hidden, or maybe even non-existent. But they were wrong. And that, she realized, was the lesson. Emily had learned one of life's hardest lessons that day: never underestimate someone based on what you see on the outside. People, especially those who carry themselves with humility, often held the greatest power of all. The strength of those who remained in the background, unassuming, yet capable of stepping into action when necessary. She thought about those bikers. The way they had strutted into the diner, all confident and cocky, thinking they could push her around. They had no idea who she really was, what she had been taught, and what she was capable of. They had looked at her, a 22-year-old cashier with no obvious power, and they had assumed she was easy prey. But Emily had shown them that strength doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't shout from the rooftops or walk into the room with a flash. It waits, silently, patiently, until it's needed most. And as she cleaned the last of the tables and grabbed her bag to head out, Emily couldn't help but think of the world around her. How many people went about their days, unnoticed, underestimated, and unheard? How many people carried within them a quiet strength that no one could see? She thought of Danny, the shy kid who had worked beside her for months without realizing that the woman who handed him his apron every day was capable of much more than just pouring coffee. How many times had Danny or others like him written her off? How many times had they believed her to be just another face in the crowd? And then she thought of the customers who came into the diner, the regulars who had always known her as the polite young woman who smiled and made small talk. They hadn't expected anything more. But now, after witnessing what she was capable of, Emily knew they would look at her differently. They might not understand it, but they would respect it. They would see her strength, even if they didn't fully grasp it. Emily's footsteps echoed through the parking lot as she walked toward her car, her mind still racing with thoughts. The quiet power she had always carried within her had come to the forefront in the most unexpected of ways. And now, she realized, there was no going back. She wasn't just the quiet cashier anymore. She wasn't the girl who hid in the shadows, waiting for someone else to speak up. She was the woman who stood firm in the face of danger, the one who protected those who couldn't protect themselves. She was more than just her father's daughter. She was Emily Dawson, strong, capable, and fully in control of her own destiny. There would always be people who underestimated her. There would always be those who couldn't see the quiet power that lay within her. But Emily was no longer concerned with what they thought. She knew who she was, and that was enough. As Emily slid into her car and turned the key, the engine roared to life, and she drove away from Mac's Diner. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't just another drive home after work. It was a drive that symbolized a new beginning, a new understanding of who she was and what she could do. The world could keep underestimating her. It could keep overlooking her quiet nature and the strength she carried deep inside. But she knew the truth. And that truth was enough to carry her forward. Sometimes, the quietest people hold the greatest strength. And those who underestimate them, they never see it coming.